The moment I realized my family had already erased me from my own future was not when they tried to take my house. It was when my daughter-in-law looked straight at me across the dinner table and said, "At his age, people do not start over anymore. They just become responsibilities." The room went quiet after that. Not shocked quiet. Worse. Comfortable quiet. The kind where everybody hears the insult but nobody thinks it is important enough to stop. I remember the soft clink of silverware against ceramic plates. The smell of baked ham and sweet potatoes. Football playing low on the television in the living room. Outside, cold October rain tapped softly against the windows of my little house near Lake Marion. The same house I spent 38 years paying off one transmission repair at a time. My name is Harold Whitaker. I am 72 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that if you worked hard enough and loved your family enough, you would never truly end up alone. I know better now. Garrett, my son, sat beside Melissa at the table wearing that tight half-smile he uses at work when he wants clients to agree with him without asking questions. He did not defend me. He just took another sip of wine and stared down at his plate like the conversation had nothing to do with him. Piper, my granddaughter, froze for half a second beside me. I noticed because she always notices everything. She had one of those old film cameras hanging from her neck again, the kind kids her age suddenly call vintage. She looked at me like she wanted to say something, but teenagers learn very early which adults are safe to challenge and which ones control the atmosphere in a room. Melissa reached over and touched my wrist with fake gentleness. "We are only worried about you, Harold," she said softly. "The winters here are getting harder every year. Maybe it is time to think about somewhere with more support." Somewhere with more support. That was the phrase she used instead of saying assisted living. Instead of saying supervised meals and emergency bracelets and strangers checking whether I was still breathing every morning. I gave a small nod like the words did not cut straight through me. That is what old men learn to do after enough years. We learn how to make humiliation look like maturity. I focused on my mashed potatoes while Melissa continued talking about safety rails in bathrooms and communities designed for seniors. Designed for seniors. Like we are products that eventually belong on a different shelf. The funny thing is, nobody asked what I wanted. Not one person at that table asked if I was happy in my own home. Nobody asked why I still spent every morning inside my garage repairing old radios that people from town brought me because they trusted my hands more than new machines. Nobody asked why I still kept my late wife Evelyn's winter coat hanging by the front door even 5 years after cancer took her away from me. They only talked about me, around me, over me, as if I had already started disappearing. Then Piper quietly slid something toward me under the table. A photograph she had developed herself in school. It showed me standing in the garage earlier that week, sunlight cutting through the dusty windows while I repaired a cracked wooden radio from 1963. On the back, she had written 5 words in blue ink. "You still look alive here." I stared at that sentence longer than I should have. Because the truth was I had not felt alive in a very long time. And 3 days later, Naomi Mercer knocked on my garage door and changed everything I thought I knew about the rest of my life. Naomi Mercer did not look like someone about to change another person's life. She looked exhausted. That was the first thing I noticed when she stepped into my garage that Thursday afternoon carrying a dusty wooden radio against her hip. Her brown coat was damp from the lake wind, strands of dark blonde hair stuck to her cheeks, and there were faint purple shadows under her eyes like she had not slept properly in weeks. "My father said you still fix these," she said, setting the radio carefully on my workbench beside a pile of screwdrivers and old vacuum tubes. Her voice was calm, but something underneath it sounded frayed thin. I recognized the radio immediately. A Zenith from the late 1960s. Leon Mercer used to play Tigers baseball games on it every summer while the whole neighborhood sat outside drinking lemonade before life got complicated and people stopped visiting each other without texting first. "This thing belongs in a museum," I muttered. Naomi smiled faintly. "That is what my father said. But he still turns it on every morning." I nodded and adjusted my glasses, pretending to focus on the cracked dial because I suddenly became aware of how empty my garage must have looked to another person. One folding chair. One old heater humming in the corner. My late wife Evelyn's gardening gloves still hanging beside the door exactly where she left them. Naomi glanced at the gloves but did not ask about them. Most people either ignored grief or attacked it directly. She didn't either. That alone made her different. How is your father doing? I asked quietly. Her smile disappeared almost immediately. Worse. She folded her arms tightly across her chest. His hands shake now. Some days he forgets what month it is. I knew that kind of fear. Watching somebody disappear in pieces while their body stubbornly stayed behind. Naomi looked around the garage again before speaking. I used to hear your wife playing records through these windows when I was little, she said softly. My mother hated jazz, but she always stopped watering flowers whenever Evelyn played Ella Fitzgerald. That caught me off guard. Nobody said Evelyn's name anymore except me. Garrett avoided it because grief embarrassed him. Melissa treated my wife's photographs like decorations from another homeowner. Even I had started speaking about Evelyn less often because watching people become uncomfortable with your memories is its own kind of loneliness. Naomi reached into her purse and pulled out a folded pharmacy receipt. I noticed the total immediately. $382. Heart medication. I found this outside by your mailbox yesterday, she said. I think it blew out of your pocket. I felt heat creep into my face. Old men notice when dignity slips in public. Especially around younger women. Prices keep changing, I muttered. That is all. Naomi studied me for a moment too long. Not pitying. Thinking. Then she surprised me completely. Can I ask you something strange? She said. I gave a dry laugh. At my age, strange is usually all that is left. But Naomi did not smile this time. She stepped closer to the workbench and lowered her voice. If I asked you to marry me by Friday, she said carefully, would you think I had completely lost my mind? I stared at her, certain I misunderstood. Somewhere outside, a dog barked down the street. The heater clicked loudly behind us. Naomi's face stayed serious. No flirting. No teasing. Just exhaustion mixed with determination. Miss Mercer, I finally said, you are 41 years old. I know exactly how old I am, she replied. That is not the problem. My chest tightened strangely. Not romance. Confusion. Alarm. Curiosity. Then what is the problem? I asked. Naomi looked toward the rainy window before answering. My father is dying. The diner is collapsing. The bank wants the property by Monday. And your family is not the only one trying to decide what happens to somebody else before they are even gone. Then she looked back at me with eyes so tired they almost scared me. I think we might be able to save each other. For the next 24 hours, I convinced myself Naomi Mercer had been speaking emotionally, not rationally. People under pressure say strange things. I knew that better than anyone. After Evelyn died, I once spent $300 on a treadmill at 2 in the morning, because I thought becoming healthier would somehow stop me from feeling lonely. Grief makes people bargain with absurd ideas. So Friday morning, I drove my old Ford pickup to Mercer's diner expecting Naomi to apologize awkwardly and pretend the conversation in my garage had never happened. Instead, I found her sitting alone in a back booth with a stack of bank paper spread across the table beside 2 untouched cups of coffee. The diner looked tired. That is the only way I can describe it. The red vinyl booths had cracks in them now. Half the neon letters in the front window no longer lit up. The old jukebox near the bathrooms was silent. I remembered when the place used to smell like bacon grease and loud laughter at 6 in the morning with factory workers crowding every stool before shifts started. Now the room echoed when someone dropped a fork. Naomi pushed one mug toward me as I sat down. Black. No sugar, she said. You still drink it the same way.
I blinkte her.
How would you know that? You used to come here every Saturday with your wife after grocery shopping, she answered simply. My mother noticed everything. I guess I inherited that. She slid a paper across the table. Past due notices. Commercial loan warnings. Final review. I did not understand half the legal wording, but I understood desperation when I saw it. Leah never said things were this bad, I muttered. Naomi gave a tired laugh. Pride is expensive. Outside the front window, gray lake clouds rolled low over town. A delivery truck splashed through rainwater near the curb. Somewhere in the kitchen, somebody dropped a pan hard enough to make the ceiling shake. The bank gives us until Monday, Naomi said quietly. Then they take the diner. And marrying me fixes that? I asked carefully. Naomi rubbed both hands together like she was cold even inside the warm diner. Not directly. She hesitated for the first time since I met her. But there is a clause in the property agreement. My father signed it years ago after my mother died. If ownership transfers through immediate family restructuring, the foreclosure process pauses for 90 days.
Ist daher.
That sounds dangerously close to fraud. It is not fraud, she replied quickly. It is stupid. There is a difference. For the first time I almost smiled. Almost. Naomi looked down at her untouched coffee before speaking again. I know how this sounds, Harold. Her voice softened. I know people will talk. But I am tired of losing things because I waited for perfect solutions. The diner door opened suddenly, letting cold air rush inside. Leon Mercer shuffled in wearing an old flannel coat, his hands trembling slightly as he carried a grocery bag. When he saw me sitting there, confusion crossed his face first. Then embarrassment. You told him, he said quietly to Naomi. She nodded once. Leon set the groceries down slowly and looked at me, with eyes that seemed older than they had last summer. I did not want Charity, he said. That girl already gave up enough years taking care of me. Naomi immediately looked irritated. Dad. No, Leon continued softly. He deserves honesty. He turned back toward me. You know what scares me most, Harold? It is not dying. It is leaving her alone with all this. Naomi stared down at the table so hard I thought she might cry, but she did not. That was when I realized something important about her. Naomi Mercer carried pain the same way I did. Quietly, like speaking it aloud might make other people uncomfortable. The waitress finally walked over and refilled my coffee. She glanced between Naomi and me with open curiosity before asking, So, is it true? Naomi looked up. Is what true? The waitress smiled awkwardly. People are already saying you two are getting married. My stomach dropped. Because I had not even answered yet. News travels fast in small towns near water. Faster than weather. Faster than truth. By the time I drove home from Mercer's diner that afternoon, somebody had already posted about me in the Lake Marion Community Facebook group. Looks like old Harold finally found himself a younger bride. There was even a blurry photograph attached from outside the diner window. Naomi sitting across from me. My truck parked outside. 200 comments underneath. Some joking. Some cruel. Some pretending concern while enjoying every second of the spectacle. I found out because Garrett called before I even made it into my driveway. Tell me this is not real, he said the moment I answered. No hello. No, how are you? Just panic. I stayed quiet long enough for him to grow impatient. Dad, he snapped. People are sending this to Melissa. I looked at my mailbox leaning crooked beside the road, paint peeling off the red flag. Somebody had stuffed grocery coupons halfway inside. Funny, I said slowly. Nobody seemed too worried about my personal life last week. Garrett exhaled sharply through his nose, the way he does when clients become difficult. This is not about personal life. This is about people taking advantage of you. There it was. Not concern. Positioning. Naomi Mercer is not taking advantage of me, I replied. You barely know her, he shot back. You are 72 years old. I almost laughed at that, as if age itself automatically erased judgment. And you are 45, I answered quietly. But I still remember teaching you not to leave bicycles in the driveway. Silence. Heavy silence. Then his voice hardened. Melissa and I are coming over tonight. The line disconnected before I could answer. Around 6 o'clock, they arrived carrying enough fake kindness to stock a church fundraiser. Melissa brought chicken noodle soup in a ceramic container she made sure to mention was homemade twice. Garrett carried bottled water and a new pill organizer still inside pharmacy packaging. I watched them move through my kitchen with the strange efficiency of people preparing for an intervention they had rehearsed in the car. Melissa opened cabinets without asking, checking expiration dates like a home inspector. Garrett stood near the sink studying unpaid envelopes stacked beside my toaster. Dad, he said carefully, why did you not tell us things were getting tight financially? My stomach tightened immediately. There it was again. That word. Financially. Never emotionally. Never spiritually. Just financially. Things are not tight, I lied. Garrett picked up a pharmacy bill from the counter before I could stop him. $382 every month is not sustainable. Melissa jumped in softly. And winter heating costs are going up again. She sat beside me at the table, lowering her voice into that practice tone she used when pretending compassion. We are only worried you might make impulsive decisions because you are lonely. Lonely. Such a clean word for something so humiliating. Garrett crouched beside my chair like I was already in a hospital. Dad, if this woman needs money, there are other ways to help her. I stared at him for several seconds before asking quietly, do you know what Naomi does for work? He blinked. What? Do you know anything about her? He opened his mouth then stopped. Melissa answered instead. She works around dying people, right? Hospice music. Therapist. The way she said it made it sound suspicious somehow. I leaned back slowly. You both decided she was dangerous before learning a single true thing about her. Garrett stood up immediately, frustrated now. Because normal 41-year-old women do not ask retired men to marry them after one conversation. The room went still after that. Even Melissa stopped pretending to organize things. I looked at my son standing in my kitchen, wearing a $400 jacket while discussing my life like a liability report. And suddenly I saw something clearly for the first time. Garrett was not afraid I would embarrass the family. He was afraid I might still belong to myself. Saturday morning started with a headache and ended with half the town staring at me like I had escaped from a nursing home. Every October, Lake Marion held a harvest fair near the old train depot. Local vendors sold homemade pies, high school bands played country covers badly off-key, and retired couples wandered around carrying caramel apples while pretending summer had not officially died yet. Evelyn used to love that fair. She always bought cinnamon candles we never needed, and knit scarves from the church booth even though our closet was already full of them. I almost stayed home that morning. But around 9:30, Piper showed up at my door holding her camera and wearing an oversized green sweatshirt with paint stains on the sleeves. You need fresh air, she announced. And I need photos for school. Before I could argue, she was already walking toward my truck. 10 minutes later, we were eating hot dogs near the music tent, while Piper photographed rusted tractors like they belonged in an art museum. For the first time in months, I felt strangely normal. Not young. Not healed. Just included in the world again instead of watching it through windows. Then Naomi arrived. She was carrying 2 paper bags full of homemade muffins from the diner booth, her hair tied back loosely, cheeks pink from the cold wind coming off the lake. Several people noticed her immediately. I could feel it. Heads turning. Conversations lowering. Small towns survive on observation. Naomi walked straight toward us anyway. Your granddaughter already bullied me into buying raffle tickets, she said dryly, handing Piper one of the bags. Piper grinned proudly. You looked guilty enough to say yes. Naomi laughed softly and the sound surprised me. Until then, I had only seen tiredness in her. This was different. Lighter. Human. She sat beside me on the wooden bench without hesitation, and almost immediately I noticed people pretending not to stare. A group of women near the craft tables whispered openly while glancing in our direction. One older man nudged his friend hard enough to make both of them laugh. Naomi noticed too. But instead of shrinking, she calmly opened a muffin wrapper and asked me whether I had ever fixed jukeboxes before cassette tapes ruined everything. It was such an ordinary question that I found myself answering honestly. 20 minutes later, I was telling her about rebuilding a diner jukebox in 1987, while Piper snapped photographs of us talking. Then everything shifted. Garrett appeared out of nowhere near the cider stand, still wearing his office clothes like he had driven straight from a client meeting. Melissa followed beside him carrying an expensive leather purse and the expression of somebody arriving at a crime scene. Garrett stopped cold when he saw Naomi sitting next to me. Dad, he said sharply, loud enough for nearby people to hear. Conversations around us immediately slowed. Naomi remained calm. Piper quietly lowered her camera. We need to talk. I looked at my son standing there stiff and angry in the middle of a harvest fair full of pumpkins and children running around with painted faces, and suddenly I felt tired in a way sleep could not fix. Then talk, I answered. Garrett glanced directly at Naomi before speaking. Not here. Melissa stepped closer with that same rehearsed concern she always used in public. Harold, people are talking about you. Naomi finally looked up. People usually do, she said evenly. Melissa ignored her completely. Piper's classmates are seeing things online now. This affects the family. Piper's face immediately changed. Embarrassment. Teenagers carry social shame like broken glass. Garrett lowered his voice slightly, but not enough. Dad, this situation is getting inappropriate. Something inside me stiffened at that word. Inappropriate. As if sitting beside another adult in public somehow violated rules I had never agreed to. Naomi stood slowly, brushing crumbs from her coat. I should go, she said quietly. But before she could leave, Piper suddenly spoke up. Why are you acting like Grandpa committed a crime? Garrett stared at his daughter in disbelief. Melissa immediately snapped. Piper, enough. But Piper did not stop. No, seriously. You both ignored him for years. Now suddenly everybody cares because somebody else does. The silence after that felt enormous. Nearby, the high school band kept playing badly through old speakers while my son looked at his own daughter like he no longer recognized her. And for the first time since all this started, I realized the damage would not stay between adults anymore. After the harvest fair, Piper stopped answering her parents' calls for almost 2 days. Not out of rebellion. Out of disappointment. There is a difference, and anybody who has raised a teenager carefully enough knows it. Sunday evening, she sat cross-legged on the floor of my garage, while I worked on an old Philco radio with a flashlight between my teeth because the overhead bulb kept flickering. Piper was developing photographs in a portable darkroom kit she bought online with babysitting money. The whole garage smelled faintly of chemicals, dust, and machine oil. Mom cried after the fair, she said suddenly without looking up. I tightened a screw slowly. Your mother cries when she feels embarrassed. Piper clipped a photograph onto the drying line beside her. No. This was different. That got my attention. Piper rarely defended adults. She had grown up watching them perform too much. What do you mean? I asked. Piper hesitated before answering. She asked Dad if he remembered the last time you laughed before all this happened. My hand stopped moving for a second. Piper finally looked at me directly. Neither of them could remember. Something about that settled heavily inside my chest. Because the truth was I could not remember either. The garage fell quiet except for the soft hum of the heater in the corner. Piper stood and handed me one of the photographs she had developed from the fair. Naomi and I sitting on the bench near the pumpkin displays. I was mid-sentence, one hand lifted while talking. Smiling. Not polite smiling. Real smiling. I stared at the image longer than I meant to. You look younger here, Piper murmured. I almost argued with her, but then I noticed something worse. Hope. Tiny dangerous hope. At my age, hope becomes frightening because you know exactly how expensive disappointment can be. Monday morning, Naomi called before sunrise. Her voice sounded strained immediately. Dad fell in the diner kitchen, she said. Nothing broken, but the doctor wants him monitored today. 40 minutes later, I was carrying boxes of frozen supplies through the diner back door because Naomi was trying to manage everything alone while also answering insurance calls at the counter. The diner looked even rougher during daylight. A section of ceiling tile near the kitchen had water damage. One booth was patched with silver duct tape. The pie display held only 2 slices of cherry left under cloudy glass. Naomi stood behind the register with her hair tied up messily using a pencil. She looked exhausted enough to disappear. You do not have to stay, she told me after I finished stacking supplies. I know your family probably already thinks this whole thing is insane. They thought I was old before they thought I was insane, I replied. That earned the smallest smile from her all day. Around lunchtime, the diner filled unexpectedly because a school bus carrying a visiting football team broke down outside town. Within minutes, every booth was packed with hungry teenagers wearing blue jerseys and muddy cleats. Naomi moved nonstop between tables while trying to calm a supplier on the phone threatening to suspend deliveries over unpaid invoices. I watched her carry 3 plates at once while apologizing to customers for the broken jukebox and refilling sodas without writing anything down. There was no performance in it. No manipulation. Just survival. Halfway through the rush, Naomi disappeared briefly into the kitchen. I followed a minute later and found her leaning both hands against the stainless steel counter, eyes closed tightly. You all right? I asked carefully. She laughed once under her breath, but there was no humor in it. Do you know what the bank manager told me this morning? She asked quietly. I shook my head. He said maybe it was time to accept that some places are not meant to survive forever. She opened her eyes slowly then. People say that a lot when they are talking about old buildings. And old people. Before I could answer, the cook shouted that table 7 needed service. Naomi inhaled deeply, straightened her shoulders, and immediately walked back into the dining room smiling for strangers again. But this time when I watched her, something inside me shifted. Not romance. Not yet. Respect. The kind that arrives slowly when you realize somebody else has been carrying invisible weight for a very long time. By Tuesday afternoon, people had stopped whispering when I walked into places. They had started speaking directly instead. That is how small-town judgment works. First it watches, then it performs. I was standing inside Wheeler's pharmacy waiting for my heart medication when Mrs. Delaney from church touched my arm gently and asked, "So when is the wedding?" Loud enough for half the store to hear. 2 teenagers near the greeting cards laughed immediately. I gave a polite smile because old men learn early that public humiliation becomes worse if you react emotionally. But the truth was my chest had already been tight all morning. Not medically. Socially. The pharmacist handed me my prescription bag with the careful expression people use around unstable strangers. Insurance covered less this month, he said quietly. Total comes to $411. $411. I stared at the number longer than I should have. Behind me, somebody sighed impatiently in line. I reached slowly for my wallet, mentally calculating what bill I could delay this time. Heating. Groceries. Gas. Bride. Before I could decide, another hand slid a credit card onto the counter beside mine. Naomi. Absolutely. Not. I muttered immediately. She ignored me completely and looked at the pharmacist instead. Run it. Naomi, I said more firmly this time. Do not do that. She finally turned toward me, calm but exhausted. You spent 6 hours unloading supplies at the diner yesterday. That was helping. And this is helping. The pharmacist pretended not to listen while avoiding eye contact entirely. I felt heat crawl into my neck. Not because of charity, because of visibility. Dependency feels different when witnesses are involved. Outside the pharmacy, I finally stopped walking beside her near the newspaper stand. You cannot keep doing things like that, I said quietly. Naomi folded her arms against the cold wind coming off the lake. Then stop acting embarrassed every time somebody helps you. That irritated me more than it should have. I spent 43 years paying my own way. And now medication costs $400 a month, she answered evenly. Reality does not care about pride, Harold. I wanted to argue. Instead, I looked away toward Main Street where workers were hanging early Christmas lights between storefronts already struggling to stay open. Lake Marion had become one of those towns where people still decorated hopefully, while businesses quietly disappeared behind them. Naomi softened slightly when she saw my expression. I am not trying to make you feel weak, she said. I just know what exhaustion looks like. Before I could answer, my phone rang. Garrett. The second I picked up, I knew something was wrong. Where are you? He asked sharply. Downtown. Silence. Then, Dad, Melissa just got a call from the bank. My stomach tightened immediately. What bank? The diner's bank. He lowered his voice. They asked whether you were financially involved with Naomi Mercer. I stared at Naomi standing beside me holding a paper pharmacy bag while traffic rolled slowly past us. Why would they call Melissa? I asked carefully. Garrett hesitated too long before answering. Because Melissa handled some of their commercial listings last year. My pulse slowed instead of rising. That was always the moment I became most dangerous emotionally. Not when angry, when suddenly calm. Did Melissa ask questions about Naomi's finances? I asked. Garrett exhaled heavily. Dad, we are trying to protect you. There it was again. Protect. Such a polite word for control. No, I said quietly. You are trying to investigate her. Garrett's silence confirmed everything. I looked at Naomi then. Really looked at her. The tired eyes. The overworked hands. The woman carrying bills, patients, a failing diner, And a sick father mostly alone while my own family treated her like a criminal because she entered my life unexpectedly. Something inside me shifted again. Not dramatically. Not magically. Just enough to hurt differently. Tell Melissa, I said calmly into the phone, to stop digging through another person's life before I start asking why my son suddenly cares so much about mine. Then I hung up before Garrett could answer. Naomi stared at me in surprise for several seconds. You did not have to do that, she said softly. I looked down at the pharmacy receipt crumpled in my hand. Maybe I should have started doing it years ago. Wednesday night was the first time my son came into my house without knocking. I was in the garage replacing wires inside an old tabletop radio while a basketball game played softly through static from another one beside me. The garage door suddenly rolled upward hard enough to rattle the shelves. Garrett stepped inside still wearing his office coat, jaw tight, phone clenched in one hand. We need to stop this now, he said immediately. Not hello. Not dad. Just control. I slowly set down my screwdriver. You are starting to sound like a lawyer instead of a son. Because somebody has to think clearly. His voice echoed sharply off the concrete walls. Behind him, I could see Melissa sitting inside their SUV in the driveway, engine still running. She had not even bothered to come inside this time. That told me something. Whatever this conversation was, they had already rehearsed it together. Garrett walked farther into the garage, looking around at the shelves of old tools, radio parts, and fishing gear I had not touched since Evelyn died. Do you understand what people are saying about you? He asked. About us. People always say things, I answered calmly. No, he shook his head hard. This is different. Then he pulled out his phone and shoved it toward me. Local Facebook groups. Community threads. Somebody had posted photographs from the harvest fair beside old photos of Naomi, leaving the hospice center. The comments underneath were uglier now. Midlife breakdown. Gold digger. Dementia victim. Predatory woman. Lonely old fool. My stomach turned slightly reading them, but not for myself. For Naomi. Because I knew exactly how towns like this punished women differently than men. Garrett watched my face carefully. This is becoming humiliating, he said quietly. For who? I asked. He looked genuinely frustrated now. Dad, I am trying to save you from making a mistake you cannot undo. I leaned back slowly against the workbench. Funny thing about old age, Garrett, I said. People suddenly think you stop understanding consequences. That is not fair. No, irraplia. What is not fair is acting like I became incompetent the second somebody else entered my life. Garrett rubbed both hands over his face before speaking again, and for the first time, he looked less angry than exhausted. You do not understand the pressure this puts on us, he admitted quietly. That caught me off guard. Because beneath the control and panic, there it finally was. Truth. Melissa's business depends on reputation, he continued. Clients already started making jokes. Piper got pulled aside at school today because teachers saw those posts online. Everybody thinks this family is turning into some kind of scandal. There it was. The real wound. Not love. Shame. Garrett had spent 20 years building distance between himself and the working-class life he grew up in. The old truck. The mechanic father. The house with patched gutters. He polished himself into somebody respectable because deep down he feared becoming invisible and powerless the way poverty makes people feel. And now I was dragging unpredictability back into his carefully managed world. So this is about embarrassment, I said softly. Garrett's eyes hardened immediately again. No. This is about protecting what is left of your dignity. Something inside me snapped then. Quietly. Not violently. Worse. Clearly. I walked past him toward the shelf beside Evelyn's old gardening gloves and pulled down a small metal box. Inside were 20 years of mortgage receipts, tax payments, insurance documents, and repair records. My whole life reduced to paperwork and fading ink. I handed the box to Garrett. You know what dignity looked like for me? I asked calmly. Working double shifts after your mother got sick, so she could stay home instead of dying in a hospital room. Selling my fishing boat to pay your college tuition without telling anybody. Delivering auto parts at 68 years old because my pension stopped covering medication. Garrett stared down at the papers silently. You never knew any of that, I continued. Because I protected your dignity too. The garage went completely still except for the faint hiss of the broken radio. Garrett looked older suddenly. Smaller somehow. But before either of us could speak again, Melissa climbed out of the SUV and walked into the garage holding a folded envelope in both hands. Harold, she said carefully, there is something you need to see. I took the envelope slowly. Inside was a printed document from the diner's bank. Foreclosure hearing scheduled Monday morning. And at the bottom, highlighted in yellow, was Naomi Mercer's remaining debt total. $218,000. $218,000. The number sat in my hands heavier than the paper itself. Garrett watched my face carefully, probably expecting anger or vindication. Melissa crossed her arms tightly against herself inside the cold garage like she had finally brought proof that would wake me up. But all I felt at first was exhaustion. Not because Naomi had debt. Because life did. Debt. Illness. Foreclosure. Medications. Broken roofs. Aging parents. Everybody in Lake Marion was carrying something expensive and embarrassing behind closed doors. Melissa stepped closer. Harold, this is exactly what we were afraid of, she said softly. This woman is desperate. I looked up slowly. You hired somebody to investigate her finances? Garrett answered before she could. Dad, once banks get involved, things become public record. That is not what I asked. The silence told me enough. Melissa avoided my eyes completely now. Suddenly the garage felt smaller than usual. Not physically. Morally. I folded the foreclosure notice carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Does Naomi know you have this? I asked. No, Garrett admitted. But she should have told you herself. That part landed harder than I expected. Because beneath all the manipulation and panic, he was not entirely wrong. Naomi had asked me to step into something enormous without giving me the full weight of it. And maybe she had done it because she was scared. Maybe because she was drowning. But fear does not erase consequences. I sat down slowly on the old wooden stool near my workbench. Arthritis flared sharply in my right hand, but I barely noticed. Leave the envelope, I said quietly. Melissa looked relieved immediately, like she believed the situation was finally correcting itself. Garrett exhaled heavily. Dad, we are not trying to hurt you. I gave a tired nod. I know. And for the first time in weeks I meant it partly. They were controlling, judgmental, obsessed with appearances. But underneath all that was genuine fear too. Fear that I would be exploited. Fear that aging had made me vulnerable. Fear that one reckless emotional decision could destroy what little security I had left. The problem was not that they feared for me. The problem was that somewhere along the way, they stopped believing I deserved a voice in my own future. After they left, I sat alone in the garage for almost an hour staring at the envelope beside Evelyn's gardening gloves. Then, just after 10 o'clock, headlights rolled slowly into my driveway. Naomi stepped out of her Subaru still wearing diner clothes beneath her coat. The moment she saw my face, she stopped walking. What happened? She asked quietly. I handed her the envelope without speaking. She opened it, read the highlighted number, and closed her eyes briefly like somebody bracing against cold water.
No denial.
No dramatic speech. Just fatigue. How did they get this? She asked. Melissa. Naomi nodded once slowly. Of course. The garage stayed silent for several seconds before she finally spoke again. You should walk away from this. I looked at her carefully. That easy. A bitter laugh escaped her before she could stop it. No. Not easy. Just smarter. She leaned against the workbench beside the old radios and rubbed both hands over her face. I should have told you the full amount sooner. Why did you not? Naomi looked toward the dark driveway instead of me. Because every time people hear numbers like that, they stop seeing you as human. That answer hurt because I understood it instantly. She was not talking about money anymore. She was talking about shame. About becoming a problem people calculate instead of a person they love. Naomi finally looked back at me, eyes tired but steady. I was not lying to you, Harold, she said quietly. But I was hoping maybe if you got to know me first, you would not look at me the same way everybody else does. I wanted to say something reassuring, something kind, But real life does not heal itself in one emotional conversation. Trust does not magically survive hidden truths simply because pain exists underneath them. So instead, I asked the only honest question left. If the diner disappears, I said slowly, what happens to you? Naomi gave a faint shrug that looked more defeated than careless. I sell the building. Move somewhere cheaper. Keep working hospice. And your father? That pause lasted too long. I do not know, she admitted quietly. The answer settled between us heavier than any confession so far. Because for the first time, this was no longer about gossip or embarrassment or marriage rumors. Real people were about to lose the place their entire lives had been built around. And suddenly nobody in that garage looked powerful anymore. The next morning I did not call Naomi. I did not make emotional promises. I did not suddenly decide love was stronger than debt like some movie written by people who never struggled to pay heating bills. Instead, I drove to Mercer's Diner at 6:30 in the morning wearing my old flannel jacket and carrying my toolbox. Naomi looked genuinely startled when I walked through the back door. What are you doing here? She asked, balancing a tray of clean glasses against her hip. I set the toolbox on the counter. Your freezer compressor sounds wrong. She blinked twice. That is your response to a $200,000 debt?
No, he answered calmly.
That is my response to a freezer that is about to fail. Then I walked straight into the kitchen. The compressor unit behind the freezer was rattling badly from a loose fan motor. 20 years ago, I could have fixed it in 30 minutes. Now my knees hurt every time I crouched down, and my hands cramped halfway through loosening the panel screws. Still, by 8 o'clock, the rattling stopped. One problem solved. Tiny. Real. Naomi stood nearby watching me wipe grease from my fingers using a diner towel. You did not have to come, she said quietly. I know. That confused her enough to make me almost smile. Around lunchtime I started noticing other things too. The diner did not just have debt. It had neglect from exhaustion, burned out ceiling lights, a leaking faucet in the employee bathroom, torn vinyl stools patched with silver tape. Naomi had been surviving, not maintaining. There is a difference. So over the next 3 days I kept showing up. Not romantically. Practically. I repaired the flickering open sign near the front window, reattached loose cabinet hinges in the kitchen, tuned the old jukebox enough to play records again. Even if the sound still crackled. None of it solved foreclosure. But slowly the place stopped looking like it was waiting to die. Customers noticed too. Friday afternoon, an older truck driver pointed toward the jukebox playing Patsy Cline and said, "Thought this thing was dead." Naomi glanced toward me behind the counter before answering softly, "Turns out it just needed somebody patient." By the weekend, more people started coming back. Not crowds. Just familiar faces who had stopped visiting once the diner felt hopeless. 2 retired teachers stayed an extra hour Saturday morning, because the place finally felt warm again. A father brought his little boy in after hockey practice because the hot chocolate machine worked properly for the first time in months. Naomi stopped skipping meals because she no longer had to run every problem alone. One evening after closing, I found her asleep in a booth with invoices spread across the table beside her and her head resting on folded arms. Not dramatic, just completely worn out. I quietly covered her with my old jacket before finishing the dishes myself. The strange thing was, helping there did something uncomfortable to me too. It reminded me I still knew how to be useful outside my own loneliness. For years after Evelyn died, I had slowly reduced my life into maintenance. Take medication, pay bills, repair radios, stay out of people's way. But the diner demanded action. Immediate, ordinary action. Carry boxes, replace wiring, unclog drains, show up. And somewhere in those small routines, I started noticing the silence inside me changing shape. Sunday afternoon, Piper visited unexpectedly, while I was repainting the chipped railing near the diner entrance. She stared at me for several seconds before laughing softly. "Mom says you have basically become unpaid maintenance staff." "Your mother is not entirely wrong," I admitted. Piper lifted her camera and snapped a photo before sitting beside me on the steps. "You look different lately," she said. "How?" "Busier." That word stayed with me the rest of the day. Not happier. Not younger. Busier. like life had stopped waiting around me and started moving again. But that evening, just before closing time, Naomi walked out of the office holding another envelope from the bank. One glance at her face told me immediately that repairing broken things was no longer going to be enough. The new letter from the bank was not dramatic. No threats written in red ink. No movie-style countdown. Just colder. More official. Naomi handed it to me near the pie counter while customers finished breakfast around us pretending not to eavesdrop. The foreclosure hearing had been moved up to Friday morning. 3 days away now. They think we are trying to transfer ownership before the review, Naomi said quietly. They are freezing negotiations. I read the paper twice even though the meaning stayed the same. The diner was running out of time faster than either of us expected. Naomi leaned both palms against the counter and closed her eyes briefly. I should never have pulled you into this. You did not pull me anywhere, I answered automatically. But even as I said it, fear moved quietly through me again. Not fear of Naomi. Fear of instability. Of late-life chaos. Of becoming one of those men people whispered about at hardware stores. Poor Harold. Lost his mind after his wife died. The frightening part was that I could still hear those voices in my own head too. That evening I made a mistake. A small one but real. Garrett called asking if I wanted dinner at their house. For the first time in weeks, his voice sounded less angry than tired. So I said yes. Halfway through the meal, Melissa brought up the foreclosure hearing casually while serving green beans. I heard the diner might close this week, she said. That is sad. I knew exactly what she was doing. Offering sympathy in exchange for emotional distance. Garrett avoided looking directly at me while cutting his steak. Dad, he finally said carefully. You know helping somebody is different than tying your entire future to them. Piper immediately stopped eating. The whole table tightened again. I should have answered calmly. Instead, exhaustion got there first. Maybe if this family spent half as much energy helping people as it does managing appearances, fewer things would fall apart. Garrett's fork hit the plate harder than intended. Melissa went completely still. Piper stared at me wide-eyed because I almost never spoke sharply. The silence afterward tasted awful. Not victorious. Just painful. On the drive home, shame settled heavily into my chest. Not because I disagreed with what I said. Because anger felt too much like surrendering control. Evelyn used to tell me that wounded people often mistake sharpness for honesty. By the time I parked in my driveway, my hands were shaking slightly against the steering wheel. Old fear. Old habit. The fear that conflict permanently damages love. The next morning, I showed up at the diner earlier than usual carrying fresh paint supplies for the back hallway. Naomi looked at me carefully the second I walked in. You okay? She asked. I nodded too quickly. She noticed anyway. You fought with your son. It was not a question. I sighed and set the paint cans down beside the counter. I spent most of my life avoiding fights, I admitted quietly. Now every conversation feels like stepping on broken glass. Naomi wiped down a table slowly before answering. You know what my therapist told me after my engagement collapsed? That surprised me slightly. Naomi rarely volunteered personal history. What? She said conflict is not proof that love failed. Sometimes it is proof people finally stopped pretending. I thought about that while repainting the hallway behind the kitchen. My lines came out crooked because my hands cramped halfway through. At one point I accidentally knocked over the paint tray and splattered pale blue paint across my boots and half the floor. 20 years ago I would have fixed the mistake immediately. Now my knees hurt too badly to kneel properly. I stared at the mess longer than necessary, suddenly furious at my own body for betraying me in tiny humiliating ways every day. Naomi quietly walked in carrying paper towels. Neither of us spoke for almost a minute while cleaning the floor together. Finally she glanced sideways at me and smiled faintly. You know, she said softly, most people would just call that a floor. I laughed before I could stop myself. Real laughter. Tired and uneven but real. Then without warning, tears burned suddenly behind my eyes hard enough to scare me. I turned away immediately, embarrassed. Naomi pretended not to notice. That kindness almost made it worse. Because healing, I was starting to realize, did not feel noble or cinematic. Felt awkward. Slow. Exhausting. Like learning how to stand differently after years of shrinking yourself without even realizing it. Thursday evening, the diner closed early because the fryer stopped working again and nobody had the energy left to pretend otherwise. Naomi locked the front door while I stacked chairs upside down on the tables one by one. Outside, Main Street glowed softly under old yellow street lamps while dry leaves scraped across the sidewalks in little circles. Lake Marion always became quieter once summer tourists disappeared. Storefronts darkened earlier. People stayed home more. The whole town seemed to fold inward for winter. Naomi walked back from the kitchen carrying 2 grilled cheese sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and set them on the counter beside me. "Congratulations," she said. "You are officially being paid in diner cuisine now." I smiled faintly and unwrapped mine. The bread was slightly burned on one side. She noticed immediately.
Sorry.
I got distracted. "Perfect," I said anyway before taking a bite. It was not perfect. But neither of us corrected the lie. We ate quietly for a few minutes while the old jukebox played softly in the corner through occasional bursts of static. Somewhere down the block, a train horn echoed faintly across the lake. Naomi leaned against the counter with both elbows, looking more tired than usual. "Dad asked me today if I was happy," she said suddenly.
I glansed over.
"What did you tell him?" She thought about it for a moment before answering. "I told him I forgot happiness was supposed to feel calm." That stayed with me, because most of my life I thought love meant obligation. Showing up. Enduring. Sacrificing quietly until nobody noticed anymore. But sitting there in that half-empty diner eating burned sandwiches beside a woman who never demanded anything from me except honesty, I started realizing peace itself could become intimate. Naomi broke the silence again a few minutes later. "You know you still do not owe me anything." I looked down at the sandwich in my hands. "I know. I mean it, Harold." Her voice softened carefully. "If Friday comes and you decide this has all become too much, I will understand." That should have relieved me. Instead, something painful moved quietly through my chest. Because she was giving me freedom at the exact moment everyone else in my life kept trying to manage me. Naomi turned toward the front windows, watching her reflection faintly in the dark glass. "I spent years with somebody who treated love like ownership," she admitted quietly. "Every decision became negotiation. Every mistake became leverage." She rubbed her thumb absent-mindedly against a small scar near her wrist while speaking. "I promised myself after that relationship ended that I would never build another life based on fear." I noticed then how carefully she always asked things from people. Like somebody who learned long ago that needing too much could become dangerous. "And you think marrying me is not fear?" I asked gently. Naomi surprised me by smiling a little. "Honestly, it terrified me." That made me laugh softly into my sandwich before I could stop myself. She laughed too then, tired and real and slightly embarrassed. The sound filled the diner differently than silence ever could. A few minutes later, the jukebox suddenly skipped hard and stopped spinning completely. "Damn thing," Naomi muttered. I walked over automatically and crouched beside it, knees protesting immediately. "You know," she said behind me, "most people our age would probably just buy a new one. Most people our age throw away things too quickly." The words came out before I realized they meant more than machinery. Naomi did not answer right away. When I finally got the record turning again, music crackled softly back through the speakers. I stayed crouched there longer than necessary because standing up had become slower these days. Without saying anything, Naomi quietly held out her hand to help pull me up. Such a small gesture. Ordinary. But nobody had touched me gently in a very long time without trying to guide me somewhere. I hesitated only a second before taking her hand. Her grip was warm and steady. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No quis. No declaración. We simply stood there for a moment beside the old jukebox while Patsy Cline played softly through static, and the diner lights reflected dimly across the windows. And for the first time since Evelyn died, I realized I did not feel managed. I felt chosen. There is a difference large enough to change an entire life. Friday morning arrived gray and cold enough to make the diner windows fog from the inside. Naomi stood near the register twisting a pen slowly between both hands while Leon sat in the corner booth wearing his old flannel coat, trying unsuccessfully to hide how badly his hands trembled. Nobody spoke much before the foreclosure hearing. There was nothing left to rehearse. Around 8:30, Piper slipped into the diner carrying her camera bag and quietly sat beside her grandfather without asking permission from anybody. 10 minutes later, Garrett and Melissa walked in too. Not together exactly, just at the same time. Garrett looked exhausted in a way expensive clothes could not hide anymore. Melissa carried herself carefully, like somebody entering a room where they were no longer sure of their role. The strange thing was, seeing them there no longer filled me with anger. Just recognition. Everybody looked tired now. That is what prolonged conflict does to families. It slowly removes performance until only exhaustion remains underneath. The hearing itself lasted less than an hour inside a small county office overlooking the frozen marina.
No dramatic speeches. No miraculous loopholes.
Just paperwork, legal terms, and a bank representative explaining numbers in a voice so emotionless it almost sounded mechanical. In the end, the bank agreed to delay foreclosure proceedings for 60 days after Naomi's attorney presented revised restructuring documents and evidence of increased diner revenue over the past 2 weeks. It was not salvation, just time. Fragile, uncertain time. Outside the courthouse, Naomi exhaled so hard it looked painful. 60 days, she whispered, almost not believing it herself. Leon sat down heavily on a bench near the sidewalk, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. Piper immediately crouched beside him with a bottle of water. Garrett stood nearby with both hands in his coat pockets staring toward the lake. Finally, he walked slowly over to me. "Dad," he said quietly, "I was wrong about some things. Not everything. Some things. Honest enough to matter." I nodded once. "I know." He looked down at the pavement before continuing. "I still worry about you." "You are supposed to," I answered calmly. "Just not instead of listening to me." Garrett swallowed hard and gave the smallest nod. No dramatic reconciliation followed. We were not suddenly healed because life rarely works that way. But something had shifted. For the first time in years, my son was speaking to me like an adult man instead of a problem to manage. Later that evening, after everyone left, Naomi and I returned to the diner alone. The place smelled faintly of soup and lemon cleaner. One of the overhead lights still flickered near the kitchen because I had not gotten around to replacing it yet. Naomi stood behind the counter counting receipts while I wiped down tables slowly, my knees aching from the long day. "You know," she said after a while, "this still might fail." I looked over at her. "Probably." She laughed softly at that. Tired. Real. Most romantic thing anybody has ever said to me. I smiled faintly and kept wiping the same table longer than necessary. The truth was, nothing about our future felt guaranteed. My health was still unpredictable. The diner still carried debt. Naomi still woke up some mornings already emotionally exhausted before the day even began. Garrett and Melissa were trying, awkwardly, to rebuild trust with Piper after weeks of tension. Nobody had transformed into perfect people. But slowly, through small choices repeated over time, we had all become slightly more honest versions of ourselves. Naomi finished counting the register and switched off half the diner lights. The old jukebox crackled softly in the corner, playing a scratched vinyl record I had repaired the week before. I watched her move through the dim diner carrying chairs onto tables one by one, tired but steadier now than when I first met her. Then she caught me staring and raised an eyebrow. "What?" she asked. I shook my head gently. "Nothing." But it was not really nothing. 5 months earlier, most people in my life had already decided my story was basically over. Old widower. Quiet decline. Managed ending. Even I had started believing it. Yet here I was on a cold Friday night in a half-broken diner near Lake Marion with aching knees, grease-stained hands, unpaid bills still waiting at home, and a woman beside me who chose to stay not because she needed rescuing, but because somewhere along the way we had stopped making each other feel invisible. And at my age, I had learned that sometimes dignity does not return all at once like triumph in the movies. Sometimes it returns slowly, disguised as ordinary life finally asking you to participate again. Before you go, I just want to say thank you for spending this time with Harold's story. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of someone you love, or made you think differently about growing older, please support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need this message today. Here we tell stories about dignity, family, second chances, and the quiet strength people carry through pain. And sometimes, the people the world thinks are finished still have the strongest hearts of all. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story.